Kia ora, Aaron. Thank you so much for joining me today on this lovely Saturday afternoon in Level 3. I'm really excited to really have a conversation between you and I around some of the current issues, but also some of the existing inequalities across youth homelessness within the space. But would really love for you to introduce yourself so our audience can understand who this amazing human being is at this time. I'm really looking forward to sharing your mahi.
Kia ora te whānau. So I'm Aaron Hendry. I grew up out in West Auckland, actually like far west, out in sort of Rodney, Kimu ways, on a little sort of small farm out there with my sort of grandparents and uncles, aunties, and a little bit of a communal area for a bit. I whakapapa back to Scotland, Ireland on one side, and Italy and a bit of Spain on the other. And my ancestors came here through quite a bit of a journey, but we were refugees from Italy at a time where there was a lot of war and fighting going on at that point. So that's sort of like a bit about what I guess brought us here. But my whānau right now, I'm living in Massey, West Auckland still, West Hard. I live in a small little bubble with my wife, Aaron Hendry, and my little boy Wesley, and we've got another little baby coming along, not too far now, and also my good friends Trinette and Josh. So we're in a little space there. In terms of my mahi, I have been in the youth development sector for the last 10 years. I first started in my local community in Massey, just sort of supporting our Rangatahis out here, and then slowly sort of worked my way into, I guess, a professional career in it. So I worked for Youth Line for about 4 years, worked for Te Wānanga Aotearoa for a period of time, and now I am at Lifewise, team leader of the Youth Housing Service, supporting the Rangatahis who have experienced homelessness. Yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Kia ora. Oh, it's great, we've been friends for a while now, and so I'm learning something about you new all the time, so it's really awesome to have you here. I thought perhaps we would start the conversation, for us being in Level 3 now, and previously Level 4, what are some of the key issues that you're facing prior to the lockdown, during COVID-19 lockdown, and today?
Yeah, I mean, there's a range of challenges. One of the things that we have been, I guess, wrestling with is that, I guess, for a lot of us who maybe live in comfortable sort of living environments, and we all have our stress, but for our Rangatahi, the chaos in their lives didn't stop when Level 4 went up. They still had to deal with all the stuff that they were dealing with and wrestling with. And so the Rangatahi that live in our housing, they don't, a lot of them don't have the layers of connection that some of us take for granted. And so all of a sudden overnight, all of those support structures got stripped away. They lost, I guess, the proactive, safe spaces they could then connect with, youth groups, education spaces, just friends and peer groups that keep them sort of supported. All of that just gone. A lot of them maybe not have the strong connections with their whānau that they're working on, but they're not as safe spaces, so they don't have that. And suddenly, they're just there by themselves. And so that's been a real challenge for a lot of our Rangatahi, losing that connection. Our team's still sort of been there and doing what we can, but as you can imagine, if you sort of just lost everyone overnight and didn't have those extra layers of support to keep you sane, it can have a real effect. And outside of that, I guess as a fallout, now coming into Level 3, we've definitely seen the effect that it's had on some of our Rangatahi's mental health. We've seen a lot of challenge with that, with, I guess, suicidal ideation and I guess that loss of human connection, which is such a strong protective factor for people in general, really. So that's one of our main challenges. Another challenge has definitely been around housing young people who are currently homeless. So we have young people that we support in housing, but we often get referred to young people that are, I guess, in an unsafe and unfit living environment. And unfortunately, the ability to move people out of homes which are unsafe has very much decreased with our Level 3, Level 4 restrictions, as movement has been, I guess, So yeah, that's been a challenge. On one hand, for some young people, we've been able to find emergency accommodation a lot quicker than we normally would. And then on the other hand, it's been even harder. And one of the key differences in that has been young people that have been in state care have had more resources, which has meant that we can get them more support, which is great. On the other side, those who haven't gone through that system, and I don't want to call it a privilege, but sadly, those who haven't gone through that system, they don't have those sort of resources. And so finding them safe accommodation has been very, very difficult, which has sort of come to mind for us, like why is it suddenly, you know, after all this time, why is it that we've been able to get support for people so much quicker under this pandemic than we have, you know, when we've had this issue going on for generations. So I guess there's a lot of challenges in that space that we're sort of wrestling with.
Yeah, no, it's really complex, obviously, and many layers that you've described. Can you just firstly, before we kind of dive deep into some of these conversations, just identify the age range of young people that you're working with?
Yeah, so we support Rangatahis that are 16 to 24. We predominantly support young people on sort of the lower end of that, so the 16, 17 up to 20, just because there's less options available to them. Over 20, there's more options available. One of the big challenges is 16, 17, you can't sign a tenancy, you can't sign a lease. So your ability to get housing is just sinks even lower. So we try to do what we can to support those who have the greatest need. So that often looks like how much younger.
So we've got a set of those young people who are homeless, and then those who are living in your existing kind of housing stock. What has happened with those who didn't have the accommodation at the time of the lockdown? Where were they moved?
Yeah, so predominantly we work with Rangatahi to get them into our accommodation. If we get referrals and we don't have capacity in our program, then we do what we can to connect them to other agencies and other supports to get them off the street. And that often is about advocating to WINS to get them an emergency accommodation, or drawing on their whānau connections or their community connections to try and get them in a whare. And that's a huge challenge, to be honest. And like I said, like it's become, prior to the lockdown, basically to get someone into emergency accommodation, we would have to assign one of our youth workers to go down and be at WINS all day and basically have to fight for that young person to be able to get safe, adequate housing. The problem is it wouldn't be safe or adequate. It would be an emergency hotel, which was unfit, unsafe, in an environment that just was not suitable for Rangatahi to live in, and it was dangerous. And more often than not, we know that young people, when we go down into that space, would be discriminated against as soon as they walked in the door, which is why we need our team to be there. But even when they're there, it's sort of like an uphill battle. We've had cases where we've had WINS workers say, hey, no, we're not going to help this young person because they're the reason they're homeless. Basically, they caused their own homelessness, so we're not going to help them get into another motel. So that's the sort of stuff we're having to fight through. So, you know, you can imagine if you went in there by yourself, sort of the anxiety and the stress, and a lot of the Rangatahi don't even try to access emergency accommodation by themselves because of that huge stigma that just sits there. Now, in terms of like during the pandemic period, the government's obviously done a lot of work to get motels and hotels running, which is awesome. And actually just last week, we were able to house a young person within 3 hours, and we were able to put them in a motel, which was a lot safer and actually a good environment. You know, it wasn't damp, it wasn't cold, it was a nice space. The question, once again, why did it take so long for us to be able to do that, and what happens after the pandemic when we no longer have these resources in the hotels? I guess what we really push for is that housing is a basic human right, and regardless of who you are, what you've done, what maybe happened to land you in that situation, you have the right to be safe and to be warm and to be dry and not have to worry about living on the street or living in an unsafe environment because you've got nowhere else to go.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, you know, I just thought about the key messaging that has come out of the, you know, for here in Aotearoa, New Zealand anyway, is stay home, save lives. What does that even mean to someone who is young and homeless at this time? Yeah. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, to be honest, once again, going back to like what I said earlier about the chaos in people's lives not going away, I think they've struggled. If you don't have a safe home, if your home's not stable, if you don't have supportive people around you, then what is home? You know, stay home, stay where, you know. If you're just living in survival mode, you know, then what does it mean to stay home and stay safe? So, like an example is, you know, I know of a young girl that's living in her car, and she's pregnant and she's got nowhere to go. Now, I'm like, what does it mean now to tell her to stay home? Other young people that are couch surfing and moving around because the home they had wasn't safe. So they've had to move somewhere else, and they've moved somewhere else. And then there is other young people that are staying home, but home is not a safe place. They're being abused. They're being neglected. They're not getting food. They're living in a place that is overcrowded and cold and damp. It's a very different thing when your life is not as stable or safe or comfortable as maybe a lot of our own lives are. And almost, you know, the celebration of the staying home and the glorification of what we can do during COVID-19, you know, as we've seen a lot on social media. I mean, it's a very privileged sort of perspective on this whole pandemic, because for a lot of people, home's not that nice, comfortable, safe space to stay. Some of them are just trying to survive. And I guess that's what we're seeing, Rangatahis, that actually they're just trying to survive. They're trying to get by day. And then on the other side of that, they're getting judged because they're not staying home and they're not obeying by the guidelines. Well, they don't have the same resources that me and you have. Imagine staying home and not having enough food in your cupboard, you know, or know how to get that, you know, or not having heating and not having, you know, like even basics like things to entertain us, you know, like internet and Netflix or, you know, whatever we've been doing to get by. Well, not everyone has those sort of luxuries that we all take for granted.
I've heard other stories as well around some of the kind of approaches from those working on the front line, specifically within this space anyway, around buying, you know, purchasing phones to try and keep those who are in existing stock, you know, Netflix and all of that, just to keep them stay home, because it's so isolating in itself, but trying to keep them socially connected. Previously you mentioned that, you know, around this kind of concept of discrimination and potentially racism. It'd be interesting to hear the makeup of these young people. Yeah,
I mean, I'm a real strong advocate that this conversation needs to move away from just being like another social issue to understanding that this is a treaty issue. You know, this is a human rights issue. Obviously, under Te Tiriti, we have an obligation to make sure that tangata whenua have autonomy, you know, and obviously have, you know, access to land and spaces to live and thrive. Well, you know, that's not happening. And also we are signed up to ANCROC, the rights of the United Nations rights of the child, right? Once again, those rights are that young people have the opportunity to live in safe, adequate housing and to be provided for. Well, if we look at, you know, once again, one of the big problems is we don't actually have a whole bunch of research to be done to actually say what the scope of the issue is, and that's something we're really pushing for at the moment. We're part of a group called Manaaki Rangatahi, which is the collective to End Youth Homelessness. And what we're saying is we need research. We need this research to be done, because if you speak to anyone, we know this is a problem. You speak to anyone working with Rangatahis, we know homelessness is one of the top issues that we're all dealing with. Now, to go back to the makeup of the Rangatahis that we're seeing, I would say 80 to 90% of the Rangatahis in our housing are Māori, predominantly Māori, you know, small bit Pacifica, and then, you know, Pākehā, but predominantly it's Māori and Rangatahis that are living on the street and living in unsafe and inadequate housing. So that's just for our program. Now, I think if you went and asked other services that were doing similar mahi, they'll be telling you the same things. And so you've got to start asking questions. Why has this happened? Why is this going on? And I think if we dot the connections and keep going back to, I guess, what happened with colonisation and the impact, the trauma that has created, we're seeing a direct result of that is that we have Rangatahi living on the street. And one of the other issues is we have generational homelessness now. So this is not just, there's a real stigma here that we believe that young people, they're just brats, they're just doing bad things, they just need to go home and be safe. Well, you know, for a lot of Rangatahi, they have lived this their whole lives. I know a young woman who, her whānau were transient. They together lived from house to house couch surfing. Now, as the family grew up, the pressure to be able to find homes for all of them to stay together grew. And this young woman, who was the oldest of her siblings, thought, actually, if my mum and my younger siblings are going to be able to couch surf, then I need to leave them and go myself. Now, that opened her up to a whole lot of other risks. But once again, like she didn't become homeless because she was disobeying rules. She was born into homelessness. She never had that opportunity. Her whānau were always homeless. They were in that. That's generational. We know others that have their parents are on the street. They've got grandparents that have been in that situation, or, you know, couch surfing, living on floors. Like the idea that it is young people's fault that they are in their position is just victim blaming. it's not solving the issue, and it's mass discrimination. So, I mean, against the rangatahi in general, but even more so against Māori, because it's disproportionately our Māori whānau that are in these situations. So we believe really strongly if we end youth homelessness, we're going to end homelessness, because we're going to stop a whole generation from having to be going down that journey again. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really difficult to know better when you can't see better, because you're born into a life where, you know, cycles haven't been broken for generations. So it's...
Yeah, and it's not just, some people think it's just about putting yourself up from your bootstraps and you just need to do a better job, you know, get a job, knuckle down. I mean, we're dealing with deep trauma that rangatahi have experienced. You know, if you imagine living in instability, the question I often ask rangatahi when they first join our service, or when we're first talking about that, is how long have you been homeless? When did this first occur for you? And the majority of, I'd say like 90% of young people tell me, oh, I've always been homeless. So you imagine that, right? You imagine always living in that instability, and then you imagine dealing with abuse, and you imagine growing up in environments where there's domestic violence all the time, where there's drug addiction, where people are, I guess, when you're never safe, you're always on survival mode, you're always having to look after yourself. That creates deep trauma. And the outflow of that is a long journey of recovery and healing that has to take place. It's not just about sticking a young person in a home and expecting, oh, you should be grateful you've got a house now. No, there's a whole journey of healing and recovery that they've got to go through. You know, they might be just 16 and they're having to do the work that some of us wouldn't even need to do in a lifetime. You know, they've gone through far more than most of us have experienced, and the judgment that society puts on them for being where they are is incredible. One of the amazing things I sort of observe is the amount of compassion as a society we have for children who are abused. You know, we talk about rangatahi, children who go through the care system and how people shouldn't hurt them, but, you know, obviously they shouldn't. But the amount of compassion there. But then when that child grows up and becomes a teenager and is now starting to live out of that, you know, starting to, the trauma of that starting to bubble up, and you're starting to see it like crime, or you're starting to see it like drug addiction or mental illness, and they start blaming the teenagers, saying, you just need to sort your crap out, you know? I think that's just magnificent hypocrisy to say that actually as a society we allowed the conditions to exploit and allow our children to be in these environments where this abuse happened. And it's not just about the whānau. We're not about blaming the whānau. So actually this is generational, right? Like whānau have been struggling, and this is a product of that poverty that we've been seeing for generations. Now these rangatahi, as children, experience that level of trauma, that level of harm. They grow up and they start to live out of that same harm because they haven't been able to have that opportunity to heal and to recover. And then we blame them for that. You know, we stick them in prison, we ignore them, we don't allow them to have their benefits that they're entitled to because we blame them for where they are. I think that is just injustice, you know, and discrimination. And at the end of the day, I start to ask the question, is that if these rangatahi were your aunties, uncles, cousins, kids, you know, if they were yours, would you be so quiet to allow this to continue? Now, this isn't an issue we can wait 10 years to deal with, because it's happening now. And every moment we wait is another generation lost. And when we then start to think again that this is predominantly Māori rangatahi who are going through this and experiencing this, and then we compare that to the main block of power, which is predominantly Pākehā in our country around voting, you've got to start asking the question around how much does this have to do with race, and the fact that there is, I guess, an element within our minds, maybe deep in our cultural narratives, that doesn't value the life of Māori at the same level as we value the life of Pākehā. And I get that a lot of people would push back on that, but I think if we look at the evidence of what is actually happening for our Māori whānau, then we start to see that the urgency is just not there. Now, there's suddenly urgency around the benefit because a lot of people are not going to have the access to work that they used to have, right? So a lot of people who maybe were living comfortable lives are now going to need the benefit. Now we want to maybe look at reforming it. Well, our Māori whānau have been trying to advocate for reform because they've been experiencing that, right, for generations. So I think we've got some real tough questions to ask ourselves. I think our Pākehā whānau, we have some real tough questions in our community to ask ourselves about what we actually value and what is actually most important. Because at the end of the day, the system that we're operating isn't working and people are being hurt because of it. So if we actually care and we actually mean what we say about putting human life at the centre, then we need to start addressing these issues.
I think there's obviously a lot of gems in the kōrero that you just shared with us today. I think there's some obviously deeper underlying issues that we need to address just through some of the work that I've seen, that actually getting a house could potentially just be an easy part, you know, once they're, you know, into these houses, around those trauma that you need to deal with. And you spoke about healing and what that looks like, and just the complex layers that comes with a person, and that it's not a one model fits all. But you know, right now, what's being done right now within this space, or maybe not, what's not being done right now, and where do we move to next, and what does the near future look like within youth homelessness in this space? Because obviously we know what is able to be done under these conditions when there's political will and leadership and financial support. You know that there's $300 million put into homelessness, and then an additional 100 under these kind of circumstances. So yeah, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I guess at the moment this is not a problem that we don't have solutions for. We've got solutions, right? There are people who've been working on this for a long time. We've got some real clear goals around what we know needs to happen to make change, right? So for example, I mentioned Manaaki Rangatahi just before, a collective that is working together to end youth homelessness. It is a collective made up of different organisations from around Auckland who are starting to say, hey, actually enough's enough. You know, like this is not acceptable in our society anymore, and we're going to raise this as loud and as clear as possible to make sure that we get some action on this. And so one of the key things we're advocating for as Manaaki Rangatahi at the moment is to say we need to get the scope of this. We know it's an issue, but we need someone to fund the research and say, hey, let's actually get the numbers on the piece of paper to give to whoever needs to do it, to start writing checks to deal with the problem, right? Because that's a big thing. At the moment, people are saying, well, where's the numbers? Well, we all know it's an issue. It's massive, but once again, Rangatahi are neglected. They're not getting the support that they need. And if we look at the action plan that the government put forward, though there's a lot of good stuff in there, once again, the youth voice was ignored. Rangatahi need youth-specific support. They need to be dealt with directly with interventions that work to support them. So that's just one example of something that's happening. There's organisations like Lifewise, others like Kahuta Kaha, Strive, who are working on the ground supporting rangatahi who are homeless, and there's others out there as well. And they've developed models to support rangatahi who have become homeless, to provide that safe space to live and to grow and to heal and to recover with the support they need around them. So there's models out there that are working, and we're seeing a lot of success with them. The problem is there's too much work and there's not enough housing. Now that's ridiculous. We, over the last year or so, we had probably over 200 or up to 200 maybe of actual referrals that we got that we had to, you know, that we weren't able to take, right? And that's not including all the conversations that we have where we say, sorry, we don't have any housing. So the issue's a lot bigger than that. But if you think about that and you think about other sort of services as well, it's ridiculous that we don't have those options. We know that these young people are in this situation. We know that the pipeline is prison. We know the pipeline is young people in care. We should have the resources to support all those rangatahi coming out of those systems so that they have the resources they need to I guess, stabilise and heal and recover and, you know, have the best chance to succeed. But it's also more than that, because we don't really want to just continue to deal with the problem. We want to stop the issue. And that goes all the way back to our communities and what we can do to actually make sure that rangatahi don't become homeless in the first place. And this is something we can all be a part of. I often think about homelessness not being a problem itself. It's the solution to a problem, right? There's deeper problems in our community. Problems of, well, the fact that our communities are broken down and long, you know, the fact that someone can become homeless in a community means that we're so disconnected from another that we're allowing that to happen. So this is where we need to start thinking and have, I guess, a creative imagination around what it means to be community, what it means to look after one another, what it means to actually say, hey, the kid down the street, like, he's as connected to me as, you know, my own son. you know, there is a deeper connection. I think it was Martin Luther King who talked about how we were all wrapped up in this web of mutual existence. I haven't quoted that word, but basically his point is that we are all connected. We're all far more connected to one another than we allow ourselves to be. And I think we're closing our eyes to the suffering happening on our doorstep. And that is then showing up in these statistics of people living on the street far down the track. And so something that's really practical you can start doing is using your vote and your voice to advocate to your politicians that this is an issue you want to have addressed. And you want it addressed with the same urgency that the pandemic's been addressed, because this is a pandemic of poverty that's been going on for generations, you know, that we have whānau living just above the breadline, that we have whānau living in cold, damp houses, that we have whānau that don't have the access to mental health support and don't have the access to food and don't have the access to work, or, you know, what they need to live thriving lives is it's an injustice that needs to be righted and needs to be done now. We don't have 20 years, we don't have 30, we don't even have 10. Every year we waste is more suffering that we're allowing to continue. And we can deal with this. We just need to realign our values as people. We need to put human life again at the center and then work out the rest of it around that. So, I mean, those are some of the many things that we could be doing and imagining and looking forward. I guess our dream is that youth homelessness is when if it were to happen, that it's very brief, that straight away, that it's non-reoccurring, and that as soon as that happens, that people get the support that they need.
I was actually just going to ask you, who do you think is responsible for this? But it's obvious that everyone has a part to play and a role to play in contributing to ending youth homelessness. It's been really interesting because you've spoken about so many things and different pieces of work, you know, going on in the space at a services level, grassroots level as well, in the political kind of sphere. You know, this is a political issue that we need to discuss and continue to push forward. And I know that you'll continue to work hard in this space. Did you want to add any other thoughts in terms of where to next? What about hope? What does it look like? Or how are you feeling at this time in terms of the reality and the practicalities of addressing and ending this issue?
We talk about hope. I think Jackie, me and you, we talk about it quite a lot. And I can see in my colleagues there's this feeling of exhaustion, right? We had a meeting just this week where we zoomed around, I should say, and shared horrifying stories, and people, it was so normal because we have become so acclimatized to hearing stories of immense suffering for very vulnerable and hurting people, and there is a sense that people have been dealing with this for so long, people on the front lines, that there's an exhaustion. I think my hope is that if we as a people, and I'm talking about us as Aotearoa and New Zealand, can recognise how connected we are and recognise that I think in a deep sense we do value human life, we do value each other more than we value some of the stuff we get distracted with. You know, the political footballs we kick around here and there. I think there's been a few brief moments in the pandemic that we've seen this unity that has been created, even for just brief moments, to say, actually, the thing that matters right now, it's not the economy, it's not, these are things that are important, yes, because they all impact everywhere, but it's not really that. It's about our individual whānau who are suffering. We need to make sure that everyone is safe and everyone is cared for and everyone feels loved and supported. And I think that's there, you know, but we need to activate that. And if you felt that during this pandemic period, then maybe it's time to move that into other political spheres. Because we can blame the government, and people blame the government regardless of who's in and what they do. We can blame them forever, but that's not going to change anything. At the end of the day, I believe that the government, they will move with the people. And the fact that they haven't moved as quickly or radically as we want is, in my estimation, has more to say about us as a people, as a collective, and the values we hold collectively than it does to say about those people in Wellington. I think if we as a collective started to stand up and say, we're not going to accept this anymore. And we want you, our elected officials, to move with the same urgency that we are feeling right now, because this is a massive issue. And we want it to be addressed. Now, I think if we did that, we would see change. And that's my hope, that people will start to see that this is more than politics. This isn't about blue and red. This isn't about green, black, or whatever you want to stand. This is about our people, our kids, man. Our kids are living on the street, you know. And if you just imagine someone you love, maybe a young person that you know and you really care about, a sister, a brother, sibling, you imagine them being in the situation that our whānau are in, that our rangatahi are in. You imagine them living in a house where they were unsafe and they were scared for their lives, and then running and living on Queen Street because they thought that was safer than going to Oranga Tamariki or to Winds to try and get help. You know, just imagine that for the people you care about, and then think about how you vote this election, and you think about who you want to speak to in terms of your political leaders to say, hey, this is what I want you to prioritise and represent me in. I think if we started to do that as a collective, we would see the change we need. But until we do, we've got a long, hard battle to fight.
I think it's really humbling that you really put into perspective when it could be any one of your family, you know, your whānau at this time who could be struggling, who'd be couch surfing, you know, living in overcrowded situations, or homeless. So it's really, just humbling to hear that, and just helps me think about, you know, and reflect on those around me who, you know, you might not know who's doing it tough, but, you know, just the added stresses and times under these conditions. It's really, I guess, obvious that you've spoken about collective action and the need for mobilising our people at this time to address this issue. But I really look forward to, you know, us being on the same waka, trying to end youth homelessness, not just in Tamaki, but I'm sure we will obviously, aspire to reach other regions around the country so we can continue to break cycles and intergenerational trauma so that they no longer live through the bones and flow through the blood of our generations to come. So really appreciate your time and kōrero and energy in the space. I'm sure Manaaki Rangatahi would love a new media spokesperson, and I think we've found him. So I'm just really grateful for all that you continue to do and sacrifice, especially in times like this. I know it's not easy, and it can take a huge toll on your own mental health and well-being at this time. So I hope that you're looking after yourself and your whānau at this time, and don't put too much pressure on yourself, as well as trying to ensure that the safety of others are also paramount. Ngā mihi kia koe e hoa. Really appreciate you. And really looking forward to sharing this kōrero. I hope that it can provoke a lot of thought and share some insight in terms of the issue that we continue to face. Kia ora.
Kia ora.